Let's do it. Done.
So we can think of politics here just maybe in two ways right now. Like one, just politically, like what are some general principles of politics, as in what do we need in a society to live by our nature? I mean, that's one thing. You don't necessarily need extensive background in that, but it's just an important principle to have and understand how you should deal with people, exchange with people, trade with people. At least some sort of ideal in mind, abstractly speaking, how we ought to deal with each other. Um, what does it mean to be free as an individual? I mean, that's one thing you can think about, and at least understanding that in your own environment, in your own world. I mean, broadly speaking, just what is freedom, and that's important to understand. Another sense of it, we can think of politics as in political action. How do we attain these ideals? Which I think is a lot like a career interest or career sort of integration. You might not necessarily need political action. You might be interested in politics or lend support occasionally, but political action is something else. Like, in what way do you bring about this sort of political world you want? And I think most subjectivists would say it's not like politics is primary of your ethical considerations. It might be more important to consider your surrounding life in a selfish way, like focusing on your world and how things affect you. And maybe in other ways, politics might affect you more directly, depending on where you live or if you're a certain minority group or whatever it might be that can affect you. You might have greater interest in being political, say, during the Vietnam War and being forced into the draft. That's something that would affect you directly, and you might be more interested in dealing with it. But if you're like you were at the time, if you were like 70 years old, it might not be the same. You might be interested in it, but it's not the same as being involved in it. So it really depends on your contextual consideration. How does it impact you? You don't want to do the politics just because it's your duty to bring about this utopia. That's not the right way to look at it. Is can you bring more flourishing into your life by taking political action? So if you're like an artist, if you were, say, a painter, you might not need politics in the same way as, say, Ayn Rand might. They think of their values differently, or they accomplish their thinking maybe a little differently. Or I've mentioned Malcolm X before. The key was his, like, in a way, his purpose in life was to bring about a better life for himself and the people around him. And for him, that would be politics was the right kind of way to use his mind with his skills. But you could do it differently too.
Right. Okay. So, see, I guess the difference is I haven't read many books on people successfully affecting political change. So, in my context, I just can't
Yeah.
think of any. I just think of a country of, say, I'm in Australia, so like 25 million people. I'm like, well, what's one person? But I can see, I get what you're saying. Like, for example, if I was in Ukraine and a lot of my life was strongly impacted by politics, it might make more sense for me not to be make my career politics, but to take more of an interest and more of an active interest in trying to affect change or playing some small role, as opposed to not taking any interest at all. So you're saying it's contextually dependent on the person and where they're
Yeah.
at, what system they live under.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing is you have the context of people like Malcolm X or maybe Nelson Mandela, and so you see that one person might have more of an effect than he thinks he does on uh, the politics of a country. But I don't have any of that context. I don't see that as most of my friends don't. There's zero interest in politics. So like, and I'm included in that. So yeah.
Yeah, there's many ways to be involved in politics. Some are more direct than others. It could be very tangential or very distant, like if you're Elon Musk just endorsing a presidential candidate versus dumping a lot of money into it. I mean,
Right,
those are different contexts there,
right,
and your interests might be very depending on your goals in life. Because the idea isn't that you do it just bring up politics or a political world because it's utopian and you're supposed to and it's your duty. You have to think in terms of how does it bring about your flourishing as an individual.
Yeah, I don't see like,
Yeah.
if I'm like, all right, well, one thing that would be nice to flourish was if there was no tax, but like, uh, that's not, to me, that just means if you ever get to the point where you're making enough money where that's an issue, then try and find a way to go to a different country, not fight for politics in
Yeah.
your country. But I can't really think of many other examples of where, or drugs, for example, you think it's so dumb how marijuana and cocaine is illegal because now there's all this drug trade and illegal drug trade, and there's all these criminals muscling in on that market and making money and causing chaos. You're just like, well, that's really dumb, but it's not in your control. So I just like, fuck it, not going to think about it, don't care. I want to just live my life. That's there's two examples I can think of where I'm like, well, be nice if they change, but I don't have
Yeah.
uh, direct impact on that. So,
That's also why I distinguish between the political action and just political philosophy. The philosophy,
right.
I mean, I think it's worth taking the time to at least engage in what are rights and why are they important. You
Yeah.
don't mean it's not like you need to spend decades learning that concept
Yeah.
or studying the concept, but just a general sense so you
Right.
know what's relevant to your life.
Right.
Politics isn't relevant, but just like anything in ethics or epistemology, even it's not. Some people want to explore that more, or it's more
Yeah.
conducive to their values. Like I want to study psychology, or somebody else might want to read into aesthetics more to think about their how they make art,
Right.
or they might think of ethics in terms of they want to find a way to raise their children in a better, more effective way, so that they're good people too. I mean, there's different ways you can apply these philosophical concepts.
Right. Right. Okay. Cool. All right. Next question. Random question. This one here that I just spotted. Hey, I was talking to a friend on the phone, and so he's achieved all these great things, and he's talking about at some point he wants to do something of like that's of the greater good rather than just all these like uh, small achievements, his personal achievements that he's accomplished. And the conversation continued. But I'm wondering, when someone drops a concept that's foreign or alien and like undefined, like the greater good, do you usually engage that, or do you drop it and leave it, or like how do you? Because it's not particularly when we're speaking of concepts, I find that the conversation, like if someone's just giving you an update on like what they've been doing, it's quite difficult to suddenly dive deep. Like it's not, I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate to dive deep into it, to dive deep into a concept, because to do so is intense and requires someone who wants to do it and requires, could be a very long conversation, but often conversations are littered with these kind of concepts, right? Not everyone is aspiring to the same precision of thinking as say we are, but just taking that when it comes up, and because you like the person, not because you want to prove them wrong, or because you won't necessarily know yourself and you don't know what they mean, but just taking that and making it productive for both people and good for both people. Do you have any ideas on that?
For me, usually they come up in times where we really are having a argument slash discussion. So that is kind of implied that those
Yeah.
terms
Okay.
would be questioned. But
Right.
if you mean like in a casual conversation, I don't feel like I run into that much.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Usually, the type of
Mm.
people I guess I tend to befriend don't usually talk in those terms, so it doesn't really come up.
Yeah.
Not that they even agree with me politically, just that that's not the way they think of things. So I guess that's part of it. Like most people I tend to interact with don't use something so foreign to me. But I can imagine maybe one or two friends could use like greater good as. But then I would usually wonder, maybe it's because of the way I ask them questions. I'm usually interested in what they're doing, why they like it, why they do it. I don't generally ask like what do you do it for? Like I don't really phrase things in a way that they even need to talk about it that way. Maybe that's kind of what I do. Like I
Right.
usually would maybe try to, instead of like worrying about what they said, I would just worry about what I can get out of the conversation. If somebody is thinking in those terms, fine. Like what use would I have to talk to them? Unless I think, oh, they're just making uh, a simple error, nothing too big a deal, then I'll just overlook it and just ask what I care about. Because I don't need to pursue that greater good reasoning because I'm not interested, nor do I care.
Yeah. So in the context of, I can see. Well, what about you talk to someone and they said, I'd really like to do, and then they just continue talking. Would you go, sorry, I didn't really get what you meant by, but let's keep talking about this other thing? Or would you just ignore that they said, hey, I really like this thing called, what would you, because that's essentially what's happening, right? If someone uses some vague concept that has no actual definition, at least to your knowledge,
I
or you
would
don't know what
ask
they're
them.
referring to.
Usually I would just say something of it. Like, oh,
Okay,
what do you
well,
mean? That's weird. I mean,
well,
that's
that's the
usually what I'll
same.
do.
That's the
True.
same as if they drop greater good into the conversation.
Okay, I see what you mean now better. Um, well, I've had trouble with that because sometimes when I try to question about it, or just sometimes I think it's productive to ask what they mean, but other times they take it the wrong way. Like they think I'm trying to get under their skin when I really don't know what they mean. I honestly don't. And sometimes people get mad at me. It's happened. So I
just
don't think
like
I have good advice on that.
just like when I told you, after reading Socrates, I was in a discussion group and some guy talked about liking adaptability and asked him what he meant, and if he could give some examples because I genuinely didn't understand and he got angry. Um, but with that said, I think maybe I'm thinking now maybe a good way to do it would just be, I'm not really sure what you mean by that, but let's keep talking about this other thing because that's more important. And if they want to engage, then you can, because then
I
it's on
think
their
that's a
terms.
better strategy.
Because then you're not, if someone's like, going back to that example, if someone's talking and they say, hey, I really like buckle box, and they keep talking and you're like, what the hell is a buckle box? Like, do you just ignore it? Probably not. So maybe you could apply that same approach when they use ill-defined concepts.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to do it. I mean, the point is you're keeping in mind that a conversation isn't just to get them to think right or like force them to think correctly or force yourself to win the argument. It's about what do you get out of the conversation? How do you
Yeah,
gain
totally.
something out of it rather
I agree.
than getting it? Like that's the important way to think
I
about that.
agree. Yeah, I mean, if I didn't care about the person, then it wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah,
But in this case,
right.
this question was motivated by a conversation where I do really care about the person. And so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, the purpose is to, yeah, I guess that's key. What is the purpose of the conversation? And I definitely agree with you. The purpose isn't to win an argument because, well, that's not necessarily conducive to flourishing. And to win an argument might mean diving deep into a whole broader context, which is not relevant to whatever your purpose was in that conversation.
Yeah.
And will you actually gain from that or not is a different question. Like, what is that quote by Ayn Rand, which is, like one can win, one can lose, but both profit.
I don't remember the exact quote, but it's
Yeah,
close. I think it sounds familiar.
yeah. All right, cool. Well, I think that's enough on those two. Let's go to ethics. I've classified them as I remember you hated miscellaneous because
Yes.
of reading the Grushko book. All right,
Yeah.
let's see. Don't worry, there's plenty of questions for us, as you can see. So don't panic if you think we might run out. Okay. Yeah, I don't. You may not have comments on this. This is probably closer to self-help ethics,
Yeah.
but I've been thinking about it, so I'm just curious if you have thoughts. So on the topic of deadlines and time frame versus open-ended value pursuits, for example, if I say to myself, I want to achieve an understanding of principles versus I want to improve my thinking. To say I want to improve my thinking is like there's no end destination, there's no terminus. Versus achieve an understanding of principles, well, I could define what level of understanding is relevant to my life. And then once I'm there, I can then set a new goal. But to set a goal of improve your thinking, well, maybe you could say that's a value. That would be like setting a goal of to use your reason. What I don't know if it's necessarily a good way to set goals or set
It's
purposes.
not.
Yeah. But
Usually
then at
it's,
this, yeah.
well, what I first thought of is that it might be okay to have the general goal to start, but you must break it down to achievable steps. Otherwise, it's just broad and abstract, and it really doesn't have much motivational power. You just have improve your,
Ah,
like, you know what it is, but it feels like maybe you don't know how to get there, or you're wandering. That's when you need to set the sub goals. That's
right.
usually pretty well known in psychology, that you need to break down your goals. That way you can feel like you can attain them and not be too strict about deadlines. They're usually just about objectives, not about do it by this date. I don't think those are usually good because you're trying to force your mind to, I don't know, think faster than it ought to or take into account other considerations. You don't need to. It's like forcing yourself. I think if you just set reasonable deadline or reasonable individual goals without a concern of when it's due, I think that seems to work pretty well too, at least from personal experience. But it's
But
usually good to
then,
have specifics either way.
okay, but so I get the role of specifics in motivating, but then what isn't there also like when does the general come into account? Like when do you, because like if you're applying, if you're saying to yourself, I want to use my reason to live a flourishing life, like that's an ongoing process. So where
Right.
does how does that fit in? Like because that's not motivating, it's too general.
I guess you could say it's
What,
context setting. I'm not sure what to label that. That's
okay,
what
so
I would treat it as.
yeah,
Like it
context
sets the
setting.
context or set the goal or whatever you want to phrase it as. It's the way to organize these sub
The
goals.
criteria maybe.
Perhaps I'm not sure what word to use, but it
Or
just sets this context or goal or something like that.
yeah, yeah, okay, I think you're right. Okay, I need to think about
Yeah.
projects then. All right, and then what I know you said it might not be useful to impose a deadline, but isn't there an issue of if you don't impose a deadline, you can treat your time as infinite? Is that relevant?
I don't have much to say on that actually. I'm iffy on it. I only have
Yeah,
personal experience, but I don't think I can generalize it too
yeah,
well
okay,
what works or doesn't.
okay,
I've seen different ways to think about deadlines, so really I'm unsure about it.
okay. What do you think of integrating philosophy? Like I said, just philosophical detective work and adventures, but basically philosophy study with everything else. So like you've got a career in psychology, in business, I don't know, whatever it is. And yet you need philosophy, and philosophy requires active thinking and a thought process. It's not like a switch you turn on and then you're set for the rest of your life. And so how do you integrate that when, I don't know, you're working, you've got a family, or you've got you've got hobbies, and then it's like it's almost, it does, at least to me, if I'm studying philosophy, it feels like it could be a full-time job because it's that hard, but it's also that important. And so I don't know if you've thought about how do you integrate philosophy in it when you, especially when you're living in a culture where you're constantly bombarded with easy to adopt rationalizations that might come from alien philosophies that you don't understand.
I can only answer that broadly. I mean, a lot of that is, I'm not even sure how to say how I do that sort of thing is kind of
Yeah.
ad hoc, kind of how I figured it out. I could write down what I do, but broadly speaking, all I can say is be curious about a lot and oh, be focused, or at least keep your eye out for understanding the world around you. That might sound vague, but
Well, it's a broad question too, so I think it's fair to answer
Right.
the broad question with a broad answer.
I think integration can only be done in relating your goals together and not being afraid to generalize what you understand rather than specialize. I think it's about taking a big picture view about reality and the world around you and just having at least that attitude that there's a bigger picture of everything that isn't just all these discrete, different, isolated things. It's not like you study, I don't know, economics and that's irrelevant to the study of philosophy, or that philosophy is irrelevant to the study of, say, history. It would be a wrong attitude to say these are all individual, isolated things. So if you understand that integration's about putting together all your knowledge across everything and understanding that knowledge is connected, that usually helps you to at least put you in a state of mind where you're ready to integrate, even implicitly, that you notice connections.
Right.
That's the best kind of answer I can give. It
Okay.
is hard to say how do you integrate your whole life, but that's almost what it means to, what does it mean to have a personality? And what does it mean to have individual values? And how do you discover these? It's so rich and complex that it's a very hard question.
I agree. It's very rich and complex. Uh, I wanted to share this because it's relevant to this. When do you classify someone as bad or lazy or whatever? And there's this quote in the essay Metaphysical versus the Man Made, and she wrote, man does not have to be a worthless scoundrel, but so long as he chooses to be, he is a worthless scoundrel and must be treated accordingly. And then later, man does not have to be a heroic achiever, but so long as he chooses to be, he is a heroic achiever. And so I thought that's relevant because I'm just looking for comments here. I thought it's relevant because unless you do something that's irredeemably bad, you're building a pattern of habits, and at non in a sort of non-continuous in a non-continuous way, you'll be confronted with whether or not you want to continue reinforcing that or not. And so long, if you make as soon as you make the choice not to, and you do it once, you're no longer that person. I think is the way I'm conceptualizing it now. You're no longer lazy if you're like, I want to change this, and then you're beginning a process of automating new habits that don't make you lazy, that make you, say, productive or make you adventurous. What do you think of?
That sounds right. That I think Rand is probably emphasizing too much that, oh, you're like a scoundrel is just, you can easily make such a judgment or recognize that if somebody's being a scoundrel, they choose to be, but it's so much context based sometimes. Like I could say, oh, they're a scoundrel when it comes to business, or they're a scoundrel when it comes to, I don't know, family life, but they're good in other regards. Or you could say they're a mixed person, or it really depends how much you can take into a consideration. It really depends on how much of them you know, or how much about them you know. But I think you're right to say that as long as you choose not to be these things and strive to attain some other status, that is, you should treat them according to that. Don't assume that they can't be or will never be, but understand that they've now chosen to be other than how they were. And that's not a contradiction. They can choose to change. And that's the important question here, that we can't just say once bad, always bad. It's just, if they're bad, then they're bad, but they can change. In whatever way you regard them as bad, they can always change.
Yeah, I was more narrowly focused. I agree. I was more narrowly focused on specifically this issue of like when someone becomes something, putting aside the complexity of judgment and weighting different characteristics in a mixed case, because that, like you said, that's, I don't know, that's complex. I wasn't getting at that though. But um, it is common for people to say a leopard doesn't change its spots. People don't change unless there is some extreme event in their life, or midlife crisis or marriage breakdown. Like it's quite common for people to say, I've heard it a lot, where people don't change. I think the only way I think people change a lot is that those situations, but also then choice, and then I guess studying philosophy would be, because what's more fundamental than philosophy in affecting change in a personality? So
Yeah.
okay. So you might not have it. I think this is another very rich and complex area, but this is from an essay called Causality versus Duty. And she's talking about following this principle. A man does not act without knowing the purpose of his action. In choosing a goal, he considers the means required to achieve it. He weighs the value of the goal against the difficulties of the means and against the full hierarchical context of all his other values and goals. So, I mean, I'll have some questions about this hierarchical context, but what are some ways do you think duty is taken on unknowingly?
Unknowingly.
So there's the obvious cases where like someone's like, I have to do this because it's my sister or because it's my mum or whatever. That's a more obvious situation. But what are some, like, I'm trying to think, for example, like if I read an essay and I'm asking a million questions, is there some sense of duty there? Because duty in the sense of I'm trying to get some omniscient perspective that doesn't exist. It's my duty. I don't know if that term applies in that case, but is that a sense of taking?
I think so. Like
Really?
being
Wow.
to a degree, I would call it a sense of duty. Like you need to know it all because not for your own good, but it must be done for its own sake or something, things like that. Whatever
Well,
it might be, whether it's like, I gotta get a perfect score in the test because that's the only thing that says I know anything. Not because it's good for me, but just because I'm supposed to, or because
I,
it's um, another kind of unknowing duty might be that um, say people might weigh rationality so much that they dismiss emotion. In a way, their duty is to reason and to make less or pay less attention to reason or pay less attention to emotion and intuition and things like that. To ignore all those things, that could be a sense of duty as well.
but what makes it a duty? For example, if someone's mistakenly come to that conclusion, what is it about
Well,
that?
the objective or the good of that isn't for you, isn't for your sake. Becoming omniscient isn't, you can't do that for yourself. It'd be unknowing in a way because it's impossible to attain omniscience. So you're going to be devoting yourself to a unattainable, impossible thing, not for yourself even, but just because it's there and you ought to achieve it or you ought to attain it just because it's there. Does that make
Okay, but
sense?
yeah, it does. But let's take this situation. I'm reading an article um, 3 months ago, and I'm asking a million questions because I don't understand, and I think understanding requires me to understand every aspect of the essay. And so, if I haven't clearly conceptualized to myself, well, yeah, in that case, because I want understanding. It's for me. I want to understand.
Right.
So that's not duty anymore, right?
I would say so. But then it's
But
a matter of, are you rationalizing that? Is that really true, or are you just, in what way is that actually true rather than it
well,
appear?
right. So here's my question. Um, if you do something, like if you study philosophy and you're not clear on, like you want to understand it, but you're not clear on why you want to understand it, would you say that qualifies as duty? You're, I guess you could say you're interested and you want to understand, but there doesn't seem to be a deeper answer to someone wanting to understand, or like, someone wants to achieve, someone wants to achieve make a lot of money and they don't know, that's what they want to do. Is that but there's no clear explicit reasoning as to why. What is the terminus? What is the end point? Would you say that's what is the end point in relation to me? I mean, so what? Okay, I make lots of money, and so what? What does that do for me? Like making money is good, okay, but what does that do for me? Is that if there's no answer, is that then duty? Because it's not like you're doing something for
Usually,
someone else, but you just haven't explicitly identified what is this end terminus in relation to me.
I'll say usually, because duty I think would imply that the good is not for any particular person other than it's not for anything other than
Right,
itself. It's good in itself and no other reason to attain it. I mean, those things would qualify as duty. And I think if something you do does not, in fact, benefit you or anyone really, or your motivation is not to benefit anyone in particular, then I think that would be duty. Even if you say, oh, because I think that's good for me, I mean, the basis of it is still that it's not good for anyone. That thing, like you could say, I want to do good because I like to be good. I mean, but
that's
the good
duty.
itself is not yours or it's not connected to you or
Right,
you don't think of it in terms as related to you.
right.
Now, I'm leaving aside if you could be not based on duty, but impulsive and totally random about your decision. That's something else, but it wouldn't be duty. It might be just lack of thinking or lack of conceptualization or concrete bounded thinking, but it wouldn't be duty per se. It would just be mistaken, I'd say. But if you can't even
Well,
find a good for yourself or that refers or helps you, then it's not. You couldn't call it anything but duty, I think.
okay, but okay, let's look at this example. I smash my mouse because I get angry. I'm
Yeah,
implicitly acting on primacy of consciousness
yeah,
and emotions as yeah. No, let's go with primacy of consciousness. But it doesn't matter if I made a mistake or not, or I haven't thought it through. I'm still acting on primacy of consciousness, right?
yes,
And so couldn't I say the same in this sense? Like, even though I say, let's say I say, I want to own 4 houses, or someone has some goal. I want to have this massive house because they're cool, but there's not much more reasoning underneath that. Isn't that, couldn't you say then that's implicitly a duty-based ethics? Like it's not clear. They haven't clearly, whether it's mistake or otherwise, let's go with mistake. They're just not very introspective and they haven't thought it through. They want these things, but it's not a clear, oh, well, I really like this kind of houses designed, and I think 4 houses would be a worthy goal because it's a real challenge, and I just love houses because of this and this reason, and I feel it'd be great to be able to go from house to house each month, or like, way more specific details on what it is about those 4 houses that will make your life flourish. If you don't have those, isn't it implicitly duty based, or is that a stretch?
well, I'll say if it doesn't have that, it might be duty. I guess I'm trying to distinguish that there's different, it could be subjectivist, as in not based on any reason, it's just what felt right,
Right.
which wouldn't be duty per se.
Yeah.
And there's
Okay.
duty as in you didn't use your emotions at all, but you're actually removing yourself from the judgment of what's good or bad anyway. You take yourself out of it, you take any judgment of what you get out of it. It's just the good in itself. And I guess we could argue if subjective of duty based ethics always ultimately reduces to subjectivism. And I think there's a value to that because you could say that they reduce both to duty, but or both reduce to subjectivism. So I think you might be onto something to say that if it doesn't have those kind of reasons, it'll be duty and therefore maybe subjectivist necessarily. That would be hard to
Yeah.
say, but you're right to say that it wouldn't. It's anything but um, focused on your flourishing or anything but your goals. If it doesn't involve these recognition and weighing of your goals, then it's probably duty and probably subjectivist, one or both. It's hard to say which. I mean, that depends where you want to take the argument, but it doesn't, whichever conclusion you think, whether it's all duty or duty amounts to subjectivism, you're still right to say that it's not part of a rational ethics.
Right. Next question is, what principles is a man acting on when acting without knowledge of the purpose of his action? So, I mean, at root, maybe that's, well, it's a bit of a stretch for me to be honest. That's too abstract of a jump for me to go to primacy of consciousness.
Yeah.
What implicit principles do you think you could say someone is acting on when they act without knowledge of the purpose of their action? Well, they're acting on emotion, right? But I don't know, what is the principle underlying that? They're acting on emotion. Well, to act on emotion is to act implicitly on the primacy of consciousness, isn't it?
I think so, yes. I
Yeah,
would
so
say so.
we know, so they're acting on the principle that consciousness has primacy over existence.
Or that their reaction can create some better state of things, or that their mere emotional reaction will produce something that it's better to act this way than not, or better to let this happen than not, as if they think their emotions can bring about something good or desirable.
Which is the primacy of consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Primacy, I don't know. Okay, well, nothing else?
Disinterest, maybe, as in, that's the word I like to use to talk about duty, at least. I mean,
Duty and disinterest. Is
disinterest
duty a principle?
An erroneous principle, but yes, it'd be a principle of action. I mean, of that ethics, a duty-based ethics would use.
Oh, right. Okay, because it's fundamental, a erroneous principle of action. Yeah, I like that. Okay.
And disinterest being just, it's not for anything. It's detached from any purpose, which is Kantian. That's essentially Kantian.
Is that deontological ethics?
Yes, it's deontological.
Okay. There's so many strange names in philosophy that make it so alien and impenetrable and unpleasant for anyone outside of it to investigate. And they're like intentionally designed words to create disinterest and tell you it's not relevant to your life at all, like deontology. Like, what the hell is that? Who the hell wants to study deontology?
Kant did. Kant loved that. That's Kant okay. All the way. I think Peacock argues that all duty amounts to emotionalism. I think or maybe Rand argues that, but it's a much more abstract argument, I think, that, but at least for the basics right now, we should distinguish between that emotionalism of just, it feels right, so you do it, versus, and duty as in, you remove yourself from the equation and find out what's good in itself.
What's the difference between emotionalism and subjectivism? Are they not the same?
I use them interchangeably.
Yeah.
Generally.
Okay. And ism is when you have like I remember looking it up, it's like a set of beliefs, right? But in this case, we're just using it as like a way of acting.
Yeah, a frame of thinking, frame of mind.
It says in this latter part, to weigh the means against the full hierarchical context, or the value of the goal against the means. How do you see the issue I'm having, and this is actually going to be one of my explicit goals, is being able to explicitly hold and identify my own hierarchy and hold it, and then so I can make sure I'm doing the things I want to do and getting what I want to out of life. But how do you, like, what the hell? I don't know how you like weighing a goal against the hierarchical context of all my other values and goals, and then there's like so many different things that are not even, I can't even compare them. I think we've talked about this. There doesn't seem to be anything at all out there on helping you do this.
Yeah, I don't see any Rand isn't giving any way to measure it, just
Right.
that it can be measured. How do you weigh it on
So
the
that's
value
for
of the
someone
goal
else. Someone
against the
else has to do.
difficulties of the means? I
Someone
mean, you
has to
could
do
think
that.
about, I don't know, just in terms of how you might feel when you attain the goal, or what that goal allows you to do. I mean, you can think of goals that way, like achieving it allows you to do new things. Achieving it gives you a new emotional feeling in your life. Attaining a value adds flourishing to your life. So you can think of to what degree it affects these things. And another way to also think of it is, say, how long does it take to get there? I mean, you can sort of start to measure it, say, if it takes 20 years to get somewhere. But then it's hard to think that far in the future. How could I ever know what it's like, say if somebody wanted to get a Nobel Prize? How could you ever predict what it would be like when you attain that goal?
Yeah,
It's hard to
exactly.
really say.
It is.
So it's
It's
hard to weigh it.
hard to say how much you. Well, I found for me, I've changed a lot. So my interests have changed, and so if I set a 20-year goal, like, how, yeah, how do you project? And then what? You're 4 years in, you're like, well, actually, I want to do this other thing. Maybe that's fine, but
It's
that,
hard because I think it'd be useful to sometimes to keep the far goals pretty open ended, that there's multiple paths to get there. Or
right,
sometimes you could say the means to get there can also be adaptive, that this is one end you could end up with these means, but you can also go different directions, or that you can incorporate other goals into there. So it's not just strictly what you're going for, but what you're doing now, what else can it bring you? Sometimes I've found new goals just based on different paths I can go right now. Because you can think about, oh, what if this one thing doesn't happen? You need to change course. You need to find new means and new goals. So sometimes there's a value in adaptability of your means. Like you don't want to do a one path career that when you make one misstep is over. Like imagine it takes 10 years. I think like being an astronaut. Maybe it takes 10 years of full training, everything, to be an astronaut. And there's one misstep and you'll never be an astronaut, say. So you had
yeah,
an injury when you crash landed and there was an accident and you can't become, so you're paralyzed because of an accident. You're not going to be an astronaut anymore. Say, what do? You don't say, oh, my life is over. You might want to have thought about, say, like the difficulties of getting there may have been too great. Or you could say even that the difficulties in getting there just gave you more reason to have adaptability in yourself, that you should have varieties of goals and integrated achievements, because it's about flourishing, not just about do I become an astronaut. So you can think of goals like that. You can have a vast web of them. They affect each other and you fail them sometimes, but the more we get into it, I think the easier maybe is we can start developing principles of measuring these things. Rand didn't obviously give you really a measurements, but I think it's easy enough to start pulling them out. That it's not like we have nothing to go on. We can just keep pulling things apart and developing a way of thinking about this.
yeah, I'm working on that. I'm trying to work on that now.
Yeah,
There's some stuff, some material out there, and then you've just got to think for yourself a lot. Uh, my question about remember we talked about Socrates and virtue as a
yeah,
gold bar. So I
yeah,
think you could think of values almost as the same, because like if you think of broad categories of values, like if I think of, okay, my physical health, my mental health, my work, like it's not like I can say, well, I rank my work higher than my physical health and I rank my mental health lower than my physical. Like they're all related. Like you can't rank them against each other. They're not, I don't know if they're even commensurable. um, and
yeah,
so that, I think that's one, because I when I think hierarchy, I think ranking, but you can't rank. I don't see how you can rank those things. And like, let's say you're married or you've got a partner or you've got, I don't know, family, and family has some importance to you. Like it, it's, it, I yeah, I don't know I don't think you can rank them. I was thinking maybe it is just like the gold bar thing. They're all simultaneously just as important to each other, but within each category, there may be rankings. So like, you know, with work, you may then rank specific tasks or something like that. But then, yeah, the broad categories themselves, they're like the gold bar and virtues. Just like you don't say reason is more, just like you don't say self-esteem is more important than purpose, or purpose is more important than self-esteem.
So I think I would phrase it that some things can be simultaneous. Like reason, self-esteem, and productivity, I think, are just all equal level, essentially the same thing and unified. But I would feel different when you say, like, can you rank, say, your family or a friend or something like that? I think you could.
Well,
I
you
mean,
can rank a friend against a friend, but can you rank your work against your physical health? They're both values.
um, I see what you mean. You might say, you could say those are equal level. I mean, broadly speaking, I think you could, as in general ranks, but you don't need to, I don't think everything has to be exclusively the only one in its rank. I think several could be in number one, several can be in number two, and so on. And I
Yeah,
think
then they're
things could be,
simultaneous.
yeah, those things could be simultaneous. Like work and health may be very similar. I'm not sure if I could really separate
But
those.
recreation, you could say recreation, like it might not be possible to work and just feed yourself. Like you've got to have, you know, recreation or like some kind of playtime. Otherwise, you're just going to burn
Yeah,
out.
things
So
like
that
that.
might be just as important too. And it's just, you can't rank that one. But you
Yeah, but
can rank, you know, I can rank which movie I like over which other movie, but I can't rank like, you know, what's more important, the taking a break or working.
yeah, those might be hard to just strictly say which is more important. It really, what I'm thinking of is you got the general categories like reason, self-esteem, and maybe something below that could be, say, family. Like just as an example, family might be, well, I don't want to say family. Let's say your work is one thing, say, or another aspect of your work might be, say, you have a hobby, painting. But you might say those are approximately equal, that they're not separate things, but you can't say your work is more important than reason. I don't know if you could really say that. It's one broad thing, can't really be compared in that same way.
If you can't compare, it means they're not commensurable, right? That's what it would imply. If you can't rank, if you could rank, that would mean there's some CCD, there's some commensurable characteristic. But if you can't, as in the example you just gave, then that would mean they're not, there's no, you don't, the categories are not, you can't rate them against one another. They're similar. Yeah.
Their hierarchy is too distinct. I'm not sure what term to use. I don't want to know if I want to say incommensurable, but the level of abstraction, the hierarchy is too far apart. It's like comparing the category animal to, I don't know, basset hound. Like it's, we can't really
Right.
compare those things directly. The
Right.
categories are too distinct. Well, you can't say you can't compare animals to basset hounds, but it's awkward to compare that. It might misalign. It might be erroneous to just say, oh, basset hounds are, compare them to animals directly.
Right.
It'd
What's
be
faster, an
strange.
animal or a basset hound?
Yeah, that's, I don't even know how to answer that. It's a weird question.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what you're getting at, right? That you can't.
Yeah, but you can still talk about the hierarchy. We could say compare animals to fungi or something. I mean, that would make sense, and you can
Right.
compare that way, and you
Right.
can narrow down the concepts and
Right.
then do further comparisons if you need to.
What you mentioned before about the end goal, I found there's this quote. I've got a little paste book of all these little quotes and snippets I like, and it says there's this thing in blue, which you talked about
Yeah.
being not fixing something too narrow and then just twisting everything to achieve it and being close to new information.
Where's that from?
I don't know. I just, when I read books or articles, or if there's something someone says I like, I collect them in little
Oh, I like that one.
Yeah, you can have it. Paste it to you in Skype. Okay. Well, we're almost done, but maybe we can get into one more question. Two more. We have time for. Let's see what I want to pick. Well, actually, let me go to Aristotle's categories here. I'll jump ahead a bit. This is in concepts. So as I'm clarifying or trying to clarify concepts, I do notice there's recurring things that come up, like measurement, for example. The concept's important, significant, vague, clear, intent, success, failure. They're all kinds of measurements. And so I was curious about, is that what Aristotle was getting at when he developed these categories? Like every time you go up the genus, you get to these overarching things that we always use, like measurement. Is that?
I'm not sure if he was thinking of that explicitly, so I don't know. I don't know enough about him specifically to answer that.
Yeah, okay. I thought that's maybe what the categories were getting at. And then
it seems implicit, though. Yeah. I would agree. It seems implicit that if we follow his frame of thinking, it seems like this is the logical conclusion we reach, that measurements are critical to everything about categories and concepts.
What are the different kinds of comparisons? So I copied this from somewhere. Cardinal, categorical, ordinal. Are those exhaustive?
I don't think so. Those are, I think, the most common.
Does he cover that in his?
I don't think so. No. I don't think so.
Okay.
But usually I see that in science textbooks or.
Oh, these three?
Yeah.
Oh. So the person who posted what I copied must have been a scientist.
I mean, it's common to learn that in any scientific method class. You got the ordinal measurements, which are just ordering of things, like 1 then 2, or like ranking things would be ordinal. That just one is more than the other. Right. Cardinals just be just a number to distinguish them, like 1 then 2. There's cardinality to that. There's a difference of 1 between 1 and 2. Okay. And categorical is just like, is it a fruit or is it vegetables? Things like that. Right. Merely the category, without any particular numbers.